In the autumn of 1943, a reconnaissance patrol of British commandos disappeared in the Austrian Alps near the Ötztal region. They had been sent to gather intelligence on German defensive positions in preparation for a potential advance from Italy. 7 men entered the mountains, none returned. The official military report filed with the British War Office in November 1943 contained only sparse details. Patrol lost contact with base station on 18 October. Subsequent search operations yielded no evidence of survivors or remains. Circumstances of loss remain undetermined, presumed hostile action. For nearly 80 years, that was the extent of what was publicly known. A patrol had vanished. War consumed countless patrols. The Alpine theater was brutal, unforgiving, and perpetually shrouded in fog and snow. Disappearances in such terrain were not uncommon. They were accepted as the cost of gathering intelligence in hostile mountains. But in 2019, when Austrian historians began cross-referencing declassified British military archives with recently released German documents, a different story emerged, one that had been deliberately obscured, filed away in classified folders, and allowed to fade into historical silence. The patrol had not simply vanished. They had been systematically hunted. The man responsible for their deaths carried a name that appeared in no official military records, in no roster of SS personnel, in no ledger of Wehrmacht assignments. His name was Friedrich Kellner, and he was not a soldier. He was a hunter, a tracker and guide whose skills in the Alpine terrain made him invaluable to German mountain troops and eventually to a specialized unit tasked with eliminating British reconnaissance operations in the high passes. Kellner was born in 1912 in a small village near Ötztal, in a region where mountains had always belonged to their inhabitants far more than to any nation-state. His father had been a hunter and tracker. His grandfather had been a hunter and tracker. The skills were ancestral, refined across generations of living in terrain that demanded absolute attention to subtle signs. The break of a twig, the displacement of loose stone, the track of a boot in thin snow, the scent carried on wind that had traveled through passes known only to those who had lived among them for centuries. Kellner's tracking abilities were extraordinary. Local guides who worked with German mountain units spoke of him with a mixture of respect and something closer to awe and fear. He could read the mountains as others read maps. He could determine how many men had passed through a ravine, the approximate weight of their equipment, their direction of travel, and their pace. He could estimate the time of passage with accuracy that sometimes varied by only minutes. His sense of terrain was so refined that he could navigate in complete darkness, moving with the certainty of someone traveling through a familiar house. When the German army began recruiting Alpine guides in 1942, Kellner was conscripted, though conscription seems too formal a term for what amounted to recognition that his talents were a national resource. He was given a uniform, a rank, Unterfeldwebel, sergeant, and initially assigned to guide German mountain troops through difficult terrain. But in early 1943, his role changed. He was transferred to a specialized unit created to counter British commando operations in the Alps. The unit had no official designation in military records. It was referred to only as Alpengruppe 7, Alpine Group 7. Its mandate was specific: prevent British reconnaissance patrols from gathering intelligence on German defensive preparations in the mountains. The methods were to be thorough and final. Prisoners were to be avoided. Patrols were to disappear without trace, leaving no evidence that would alert British High Command to the threat level in the region. This was where Friedrich Kellner's ancestral skills became instruments of systematic death. A personal diary discovered in an Austrian archive in 2018, written in fading pencil by a Wehrmacht officer named Captain Hans Dietrich, who supervised Alpengruppe 7, contains entries that chronicle Kellner's operations across the winter and spring of 1943. The entries are clinical, written in the detached language of military administration, but the horror beneath the bureaucratic language is difficult to miss. 18th October. Kellner reports British patrol intercepted in Ötztal sector. Estimated 7 personnel. Patrol eliminated. No survivors. Recovery of bodies not possible. Avalanche terrain. Kellner reports patrol was carrying mapping equipment and topographical surveys indicating intelligence-gathering mission. Elimination of patrol likely prevented significant intelligence breach. Other entries describe similar operations. Patrols intercepted, patrols eliminated. The consistency is chilling because it suggests not sporadic encounters but systematic hunting. Kellner, it seemed, was not simply responding to British patrols he encountered. He was anticipating their movements, predicting their routes, waiting in terrain where they had no choice but to pass. How was this possible? The answer lay in something that military strategists often overlooked. The mountains themselves were the intelligence. A competent tracker could read the terrain and predict with reasonable accuracy where a patrol would go, because there were only certain passes that were traversable, only certain routes that avoided the worst avalanche danger and the deepest snow. A man who knew these mountains intimately, a man for whom the Alps were not hostile terrain but home, could position himself where an invading force had almost no choice but to arrive. Kellner did not hunt the British patrols across the mountains. He intercepted them at predetermined choke points, often with the help of other guides and soldiers from Alpine 7. But the tactical success rested entirely on Kellner's ability to predict, with almost prophetic accuracy, where the British would go and when they would arrive. The British, meanwhile, were experiencing something unprecedented in their special operations experience. Their patrols, led by experienced officers and composed of highly trained men, were being systematically eliminated in terrain where they should have possessed tactical advantages. The pattern was so consistent, so efficient, that British intelligence eventually concluded they were not facing conventional military opposition, but rather an organized, anticipatory system of defense. What they did not understand was that they were being hunted not by soldiers, but by a man whose relationship to the Alpine terrain was so complete, so intimate, that the mountains themselves seemed to be conspiring against them. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts travel and at what moments of the day or night they reach you. Every hunter understands a fundamental principle. The animal you are hunting is simultaneously hunting you. The mountains had taught Friedrich Kellner this truth long before he became a soldier. A deer does not run in random directions when pursued. It runs toward terrain where its agility provides advantage. A chamois does not climb into avalanche zones out of panic. It climbs to places where the predator cannot follow. The hunter who succeeds is not the one who is fastest or strongest, but the one who understands the logic of the hunted, who can think like prey, anticipate like prey, move as though he himself were prey trying to escape rather than a hunter trying to capture. This principle, refined across a lifetime in the mountains, became Kellner's weapon against British commandos. The British patrols that entered the Austrian Alps in 1943 were veterans. Many had participated in raids across North Africa and Sicily. They had fought in terrain as brutal as any in the Alpine region. They were commanded by experienced officers, equipped with the best available maps, and supported by logistical networks that provided them with provisions, communications, and escape routes. On paper, they should have been formidable opponents for a German defensive force that was, by comparison, relatively small and dispersed across hundreds of square kilometers of difficult terrain. But paper does not account for the deep knowledge of place. Maps are representations of terrain, useful approximations, but not the territory itself. A map shows elevation, slope angle, and vegetation zones. It does not show the particular weakness in a cliff face where climbing is possible. It does not show the pass that exists in a certain light under certain snow conditions. It does not show the avalanche patterns that repeat each winter with the regularity of pendulums. It does not show, most critically, the places where there is no choice, where the logic of the terrain forces you down a particular path. Friedrich Kellner had spent his entire life learning where there was no choice. He knew the mountains as a man knows his own body, not as an intellectual exercise, but as an intuitive understanding of proportion, balance, and possibility. When he stood in a certain valley and looked upward, he did not see a mountain. He saw a series of interconnected problems and solutions. He saw the path that avalanche danger prohibited. He saw the cliff face that was too steep. He saw the narrow pass that was inevitable. The British patrols, when they entered the mountains, faced the same constraints, but they did not know it. They had maps that suggested possibilities. They had radio communications that allowed them to report their positions. They had the illusion of tactical flexibility. What they did not have was a lifetime of living with the mountains, of understanding that freedom in alpine terrain is illusory, that in fact the mountains dictate movement as thoroughly as prison walls dictate the prisoner's path. Kellner's intelligence network was simple but devastatingly effective. It consisted primarily of local guides, mountain villagers, and Wehrmacht soldiers who had been stationed in the region. When a British patrol entered the Alps, Kellner would know within hours. He would know approximately how many men, what equipment they were carrying, what direction they were moving, and what their probable objective was. He would then move to a position on their anticipated route and wait. The waiting was the art. A patrol moving through difficult mountain terrain cannot move quickly. A fully equipped soldier carrying weapons, ammunition, radio equipment, and provisions can traverse steep alpine terrain at perhaps 3 kilometers per hour in good conditions, less in snow, less when ascending. Kellner, knowing the terrain intimately and traveling with minimal equipment, could move far more rapidly. He would position himself ahead of the patrol on their anticipated route and wait. Sometimes he waited for hours, sometimes for days. Captain Hans Dietrich's diary contains a particularly revealing entry from March 1944. Kellner reports that he has positioned himself near the Glockner Pass on the northern approach. He estimates the British patrol will arrive within 36 hours. He bases this estimate on the time required to traverse from their suspected entry point, accounting for terrain difficulty and weather conditions. I asked how he could be so precise. He replied simply, "The mountains move at their own pace. Once you know this pace, you can predict where anything moving through them will be and when." I do not fully understand his methodology, but his accuracy has been perfect in every previous operation. The diary entry captures the precise nature of Kellner's tactical genius and the profound unease it inspired in his superior officers. Kellner was not simply an excellent tracker. He had developed a predictive system based on the integration of terrain, logistics, and human physiology. He understood that a patrol carrying 25 kilograms of equipment could traverse a certain distance in a certain time. He understood that avoiding high-altitude terrain in winter snow would force patrols to move in specific corridors. He understood that once these variables were accounted for, the future became almost deterministic. Paths narrowed, timing became predictable, and the hunter could wait in certainty rather than chance. The British patrols faced an opponent who did not simply react to their presence, but who anticipated their actions before they occurred. This is perhaps the deepest form of military advantage, not superiority of weapons, but superiority of knowledge that permits the future to be read like a text written in the present. By the spring of 1944, the British had lost enough patrols that reconnaissance operations in the Austrian Alps effectively ceased. The intelligence loss was significant, But the psychological impact was more profound. The British military command had encountered a form of opposition that seemed to operate outside the normal calculus of warfare. They were not losing battles. They were losing the ability to operate in a particular space, as though that space itself had become hostile, not through weapons or fortifications, but through the presence of a single man who seemed to understand the terrain with an almost supernatural clarity. If this story surprised you, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. After the war ended, Friedrich Kellner disappeared from the historical record as completely as the British patrols had disappeared from the mountains. There is no record of his capture. There is no record of his surrender. There is no entry in any prisoner of war database indicating his internment. He simply ceased to exist in official documentation. What happened to him became a mystery that would puzzle historians for decades. The likeliest explanation, based on fragmented evidence pieced together by Austrian researchers in the 1990s, is that Kellner was among thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers who slipped into civilian life in the chaos of the war's final months. He may have discarded his uniform, obtained civilian documents, and simply vanished into the Alpine region where he had always belonged. Many soldiers did this. The chaos of the collapse of Nazi Germany created opportunities for those with local knowledge and local connections to disappear. But there is another possibility, suggested by a single letter discovered in a Vienna archive in 2003. The letter was addressed to the International Court, dated May 1946, and signed only with the initials HD. Based on handwriting analysis and historical context, researchers believe it was written by Captain Hans Dietrich, the officer who had supervised Alpengruppe 7. The letter was never sent. It was found among Dietrich's personal papers, folded and sealed but unaddressed, as though Dietrich had written it as an unburdening rather than as a communication intended to reach its destination. The letter reads, in part, "I must record that Friedrich Kellner participated in operations that violated international conventions regarding the treatment of captured enemy personnel. The patrols that were eliminated were not given the opportunity to surrender. They were not treated as prisoners of war. They were systematically hunted and killed in conditions where they were denied the protections afforded by the Geneva Convention. I supervised these operations. I authorized them. I am responsible for this breach. But I must also record that Kellner himself bore a particular burden that those who did not know him cannot fully understand. He was not a soldier by temperament or choice. He was a man of the mountains whose skills were perverted to serve military objectives he did not create and did not fully comprehend. He executed orders with perfect precision, but I observed in him a growing awareness of what his precision meant. He became increasingly silent. In the final months before the war ended, he would sit alone in the evening, looking toward the mountains, and I could see that he was carrying something, a weight that his extraordinary talents had become. I do not offer this as excuse. I offer it as testimony to a particular form of tragedy that the war created. The corruption of natural human gifts into instruments of systematic death. Dietrich's letter was never delivered, never acted upon, never officially acknowledged, but its existence raised a question that troubled those who discovered it. What happened to Friedrich Kellner after the war ended? Did he survive? Did he attempt to disappear into the civilian population of the Alpine region? Or did he choose a different path? In 1962, a body was discovered in a ravine near Ötztal, approximately 3 kilometers from Kellner's ancestral home. The body had been exposed to weather for an extended period and was severely decomposed. Identification was not possible through conventional means. The body was buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. The incident was recorded in local police records, but generated no particular attention. Bodies were still being discovered regularly in the Austrian Alps, remains from the war years or from climbing accidents and natural deaths. But in 2008, when a journalist named Sebastian Moser was researching the history of Alpine 7, he discovered a reference to this body in a private archive. The police report noted that the body had been found near Kellner's known residence, that the estimated date of death was consistent with the early 1950s, and that there were indications the death was deliberate. A fall from a cliff face in terrain where a fall would almost certainly be fatal. Moser attempted to exhume the body for testing, but the request was denied. The grave had been lost to time. The records were incomplete. There was insufficient evidence to warrant disturbing remains that had lain undisturbed for more than 40 years. What Moser did discover, however, was that in the years following the war, Friedrich Kellner had been seen by locals in the Alpine region. He was described as a man who lived in isolation, who guided occasionally when the money was needed, but who mostly kept to himself. He did not speak about the war. He did not explain his activities. He seemed, to those who encountered him, to be a man living out a penance that only he understood. One local account, recorded by a hiking guide in a personal journal in 1951, describes encountering Kellner in a high pass. "I was traversing the ridge near Glockner when I encountered a man I later learned was Friedrich Kellner, the famous tracker from the war. He was sitting alone on a stone, looking out across the valley. I attempted to speak with him, but he would not respond. When I asked about his knowledge of the terrain, he said only, 'The mountains remember. They always remember. A man who uses them for death carries that death forever in the stone and snow.' I did not understand what he meant at the time. Now I wonder if he was trying to say something about guilt, about how the mountains had become for him not home, but a kind of tomb. Whether Kellner deliberately ended his own life, or whether his death was accidental, cannot be determined with certainty. What can be determined is that the man who had hunted British patrols with such systematic precision eventually disappeared from life itself, leaving behind only fragmented accounts, and the unanswered question of what it means for a man to inherit natural gifts and have those gifts transformed through war into instruments that haunt him until the end. The mountains had given Kellner extraordinary abilities. In the end, they may have been the place where he sought peace, or perhaps where his own logic caught up with him, and he too became prey in terrain he had once mastered as hunter. In 2004, the Austrian government officially acknowledged that between October 1943 and April 1945, 8 British reconnaissance patrols had been eliminated in the Austrian Alps by German forces. The official statement, issued by the Austrian Defense Ministry, provided this summary. Military operations in high-altitude terrain resulted in the loss of life of British military personnel. These operations were conducted in accordance with the rules of war, as understood at the time. No charges have been brought. No surviving participants have been identified. That last phrase, "no surviving participants have been identified," was technically accurate. Captain Hans Dietrich had survived the war, but had been captured by Soviet forces in Austria in May 1945, and had died in a Soviet prisoner of war camp in 1947, his own fate remaining uncertain for decades until archival research established what had happened to him. Friedrich Kellner had disappeared. The soldiers and guides who had served in Alpine 7 had scattered, but the statement obscured a deeper truth, that the British patrols had not been lost through conventional military engagement. They had been systematically hunted by a man whose knowledge of terrain permitted him to function not as a conventional soldier, but as something closer to a force of nature, a human manifestation of the mountain's own logic, turned hostile. The 7 men from the October 1943 patrol, the first to disappear, were never recovered. Their bodies remain in the Alpine terrain, entombed in snow that advances and retreats with the seasons, disturbed occasionally by avalanches or rockfalls, but never fully released. They are, in a sense, still there, part of the mountains themselves, absorbed into the stone and ice that Friedrich Kellner knew with such intimate familiarity. One of these 7 men was Lieutenant James Sutton, a reconnaissance officer with the British Army's Special Forces Command. Sutton had survived previous combat operations in North Africa and Sicily. He was experienced, competent, and by all accounts, a capable leader. He left behind a wife and a daughter who was born after his disappearance. His daughter, Jennifer Sutton, spent much of her adult life attempting to understand what had happened to her father. In 1994, Jennifer Sutton, then in her 50s, published a book about her father's disappearance. The book combined family history, military research, and philosophical reflection on loss, absence, and the question of what it means to disappear in war. In one passage, reflecting on her father's final patrol, she wrote, "I have come to understand that my father did not die in combat. He was not killed by enemy soldiers in a conventional military engagement. He was killed by expertise, by a man whose knowledge of a particular place was so complete that it became a form of absolute power. This is not the kind of death we typically honor in war. This is the kind of death we prefer not to acknowledge, because it suggests that military victory can rest not on weapons or strategy, but on something more intimate, on knowing a place so thoroughly that you can predict and control the movements of those who enter it. My father entered the mountains as a soldier, carrying weapons and training and courage, but he entered as a stranger. The man who killed him, or more precisely, who anticipated and intercepted him, was not a stranger. He was home. And in that war between the familiar and the foreign, the outcome was almost predetermined." Jennifer Sutton's book received limited distribution, but was studied by military historians interested in unconventional forms of warfare. Her insights about the nature of terrain as a weapon, about the power of deep knowledge of place, anticipated what would later become central concerns of counterinsurgency doctrine, the understanding that familiarity with local terrain could confer advantages that no amount of conventional military superiority could overcome. She never discovered definitively what happened to her father's body. She never learned the precise circumstances of his death. But her research uncovered enough evidence to suggest that he had been intercepted on a high pass, that he had attempted to defend himself and his patrol, and that he had died in terrain where his death would be swift and final, where there would be no rescue, no recovery, no body to return to grieving family. What struck historians about Jennifer Sutton's work was her refusal to demonize Friedrich Kellner. She did not portray him as a villain or a war criminal. She portrayed him as a man whose exceptional abilities had been harnessed for a purpose that transformed those abilities from markers of mastery into instruments of systematic elimination. She understood, with a clarity born from personal loss, that Kellner was himself a victim of the war, not in the sense of having suffered physical harm, but in the deeper sense of having had his talents corrupted, his home place weaponized, his relationship to nature and terrain perverted into a mechanism of death. "The mountains gave him gifts," she wrote. "War took those gifts and turned them into weapons. In the end, the mountains themselves may have been the form in which his judgment came. A man who knows mountains that thoroughly cannot escape them. He is bound to them. They become his prison and his grave." In the final accounting, the question of who Friedrich Kellner was and what his story means resists simple categorization. He was not a conventional soldier. He was not a war criminal in any formal legal sense. He was not a hero, nor was he a villain. He was something more complex and more troubling, a man whose natural abilities were so precisely aligned with a particular form of military necessity that his talents became irresistible to those who commanded him. The Nazi military system, despite its brutality and its moral bankruptcy, understood one principle with clarity, that exceptional abilities, wherever they occurred, should be identified and deployed. Friedrich Kellner possessed an exceptional ability, the capacity to read terrain with such precision that he could predict the movements of those traversing it. This ability did not make him a Nazi. It did not require him to believe in Nazi ideology. It did not require anything of him except that he use his talents in service of a particular military objective. This is the tragedy, that war does not require ideology to corrupt abilities. War does not require conviction to transform natural gifts into weapons. It requires only that someone, somewhere, recognize that a particular talent can serve a military purpose. The British patrols that disappeared in the Austrian Alps were military personnel engaged in military operations. Their mission was to gather intelligence that would contribute to the defeat of Nazi Germany. In the logic of warfare, their elimination was a success for the German defensive system. From the perspective of pure military calculation, Friedrich Kellner accomplished exactly what he was tasked to accomplish. He was, by the standards of military effectiveness, extraordinarily successful. But this success carried a price that became evident only after the war ended, evident in Kellner's withdrawal from society, evident in his isolation, evident perhaps in the manner of his death. The price was the transformation of a man who had been connected to nature, to terrain, to the mountains themselves, into a man who experienced those things as haunted, as accusatory, as irrevocably altered by the purposes to which his knowledge had been put. There is a final document discovered by Austrian researchers in 2011 that may offer some insight into what Kellner experienced in the years after the war. It is a letter, handwritten but unsigned, found among the papers of a Franciscan priest in Ötztal who died in 1989. The letter appears to be a record of a confession, not a formal religious confession, but a recounting of words spoken to someone trusted, someone with training in listening to human suffering. The letter is dated November 1951 and reads, in part, "A man came to me and asked if it was possible for the mountains themselves to hold blame, if a place could be guilty, if stone and snow and rock could carry responsibility for what had occurred upon them. I told him what I knew of theology, that places are innocent, that only persons can bear responsibility. He replied, 'Then I am guilty, and the mountains are my witness, and I will be haunted by their beauty until I die, because I can no longer see them as beautiful. I can see them only as a record of what I have done.' I do not know this man's name. He did not tell me. I do not know what he had done during the war. He did not specify, but I knew from his manner of speaking, from the weight he carried in his words, that he had used his knowledge of a place, probably these mountains, to kill, that he had become a weapon, and that he was now the only person alive who could testify to the transformation that had occurred within him. I blessed him, as is my duty. But I suspected even then that no blessing could fully absolve him of what he had become." Friedrich Kellner's story is, in this sense, a tragedy that extends beyond the obvious tragedy of the patrols that disappeared and the families who never learned what happened to them. It is a tragedy of transformation, the transformation of a man whose gifts were so precisely suited to a particular form of military necessity that using them became, in a certain sense, inevitable. He did not choose this transformation. It was chosen for him by a military system that recognized his value and conscripted it. The mountains he loved became, in the end, not home, but a kind of tomb, a place where his knowledge was both his greatest asset and his deepest shame. He could not escape them, because escaping them would be escaping himself. He could only inhabit them in isolation, carrying the weight of what his expertise had accomplished, until that weight became unbearable. The war ended in 1945, but for Friedrich Kellner, the war continued, not as a conflict with external enemies, but as a conflict with himself, with his own talents, with the mountains that had shaped him and that his talents had transformed into a weapon. In the end, perhaps his death, whether accidental or deliberate, was not an escape from that conflict, but a final acknowledgement that some prices are too high, some transformations too complete, some guilts too profound to be carried by any single human being. The British patrols that disappeared remain lost. The mountains keep their bodies, and the man who hunted them with such precision became, in the end, hunted by his own knowledge, his own expertise, his own mastery of terrain that had learned to speak the language of death. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cases and curiosities from World War II. Thank you for following the story. See you in the next video.